November 20th, 2009. That is the date the Large Hadron Collider, a machine the size of a small city, turned back on underneath Switzerland after the most expensive mechanical failure in scientific history. That is the date a physicist stood at a microphone and described the machine as something that might briefly hold open a door to another dimension. And that same month, millions of people started discovering that their memories of a children's book, a board game mascot, and a Star Wars line did not match any copy of those things that has ever physically existed. 3 things, same window, and a feeling that has not gone away in 16 years. If you want to know what actually happened, stay right here, subscribe if you have not, get comfortable, and give this the time it deserves. Part 1. The sentence that shouldn't exist. There is a sentence that was spoken out loud into a microphone in front of journalists, and it has never fully gone away. It was November of 2009. The place was Geneva, Switzerland, in a press briefing room not far from one of the most complex machines ever built by human hands. The man speaking was Sergio Bertolucci, at the time the director of research at CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research. He was a credentialed physicist. He was not speaking carelessly. And yet the sentence he delivered that day has since travelled further and embedded itself more deeply into public consciousness than almost anything else ever said about particle physics. He said, and I want you to hear this slowly, out of this door might come something, or we might send something through it. He was talking about extra dimensions. He was paraphrasing theoretical physics that had been circulating in academic circles for decades. He was doing what science communicators do, which is reach for a metaphor vivid enough that non-specialists might grasp the scale of what was being explored. But the room he was standing in was not full of specialists, and the internet waiting outside that room was definitely not full of specialists. And so, the sentence left the building and kept going, and it has not stopped going since. What Bertolucci meant and what people heard were 2 entirely different things. That gap, that specific distance between the technical meaning of a physics metaphor and the way a frightened or fascinated general public receives it, is not a minor miscommunication. It is the entire story we're going to spend the next several hours inside. Because that gap, that space between what happened and what was felt to have happened, is where something genuinely strange took root. Not in the physics, in us. But let us go back to the tunnel first. Because to understand why that sentence landed the way it did, you need to understand what the machine actually is. And most people, even people who have heard of the Large Hadron Collider, have never really sat with the scale of it, so let us sit with it now. The Large Hadron Collider is located beneath the Swiss-French border, roughly 100 meters underground, give or take depending on which section you are measuring. The tunnel it occupies is 27 kilometers in circumference. That is not a typo. 27 kilometers in a circle, carved through limestone and molasse rock, sealed off from the surface by 100 meters of earth, cooled to temperatures colder than outer space using liquid helium, and designed to accelerate protons, which are among the smallest stable particles we know of, to within a fraction of a percent of the speed of light before smashing them into each other with enough energy to briefly recreate conditions that last existed a fraction of a second after the Big Bang. If you drove around that tunnel at highway speed, it would take you roughly 16 minutes to complete one loop. A proton doing the same loop inside the beam pipe completes 11,000 revolutions per second. Let that difference settle in for a moment. You at highway speed, 16 minutes per loop. A proton at near light speed, 11,000 loops per second. That is not a gap in performance. That is a gap in categories of existence. And on the morning of November 20th, 2009, that machine, which had been sitting dormant underground for over a year following a catastrophic failure we will get to shortly, woke back up. The beam circulated again. The experiment resumed. And Sergio Bertolucci, describing what the machine might theoretically reveal in the days ahead, reached for the word door. He said the machine might, for 10 to the minus 26 seconds, hold open something like a door to another dimension. 10 to the minus 26 seconds. The number looks abstract written down, but let us spend a moment trying to feel its actual size because it is important. 1 second is the amount of time it takes you to say the word one. 1 millisecond, which is 1,000th of a second, is roughly the duration of a camera flash. 1 microsecond, 1 millionth of a second, is about how long it takes a neuron in your brain to fire an electrical signal. 1 nanosecond, 1 billionth of a second, is how long it takes light to travel about 30 centimeters, roughly the length of a standard ruler. Now keep going. 1 picosecond, 1 trillionth of a second, 1 femtosecond, 1 quadrillionth, and then keep going 10 more orders of magnitude down. That is where 10 to the minus 26 seconds lives. It is a duration so short that it makes the femtosecond, which already sounds impossibly small, look like a leisurely Sunday afternoon. There is no sensory analogy for this number. You cannot blink that fast. You cannot think that fast. Light itself, moving at the fastest speed permitted by the known universe, travels only about 3 trillionths of a meter in that time, which is to say, it barely moves at all, and Bertolucci said that in that interval something might come through, or be sent through. Here is the thing about that sentence that nobody in the public conversation about it ever quite addresses head-on. The sentence is scientifically defensible. The physics it describes, loosely and metaphorically, is real physics. Physicists really do theorize the existence of extra-spatial dimensions. They really do believe that if such dimensions exist, high-energy collisions might, in principle, produce signatures of particles crossing into or arriving from those dimensions. The word door is a metaphor for an energy threshold, and the duration he named is the timescale of the interaction being theorized. He was not making things up. He was simplifying real ideas for a general audience, which is part of the job. But simplification, by its nature, removes the scaffolding. And without the scaffolding, a sentence about extra-dimensional physics sounds like a sentence about opening a portal. It sounds like a sentence from a science fiction film. And science fiction, we have all been deeply marinated in since childhood. So the public did what people do when they hear something that pattern matches to a category they already hold. They heard the category, and the category was, something was opened. Now. I want to be genuinely precise with you here, because this channel is not in the business of telling you things that are not true in order to make things feel more dramatic than they are. The drama here is real, but it is not where most people are looking for it. Nothing physically verifiable was opened at CERN in 2009. No portals were activated, no dimensions were breached in any documented, measured, or reproducible way. The collisions that occurred were energetic but not anomalous. The data was collected, analysed, and published. No signatures of extra-dimensional physics were found. That is the scientific record. But here is what is also true, and what I think is in some ways more interesting. Something happened to how a very large number of people relate to reality around that period. Something shifted in the collective sense of whether the world people remember is the same world they are living in. And whatever caused that shift, whether it was the collider's reawakening, or the internet hitting a particular cultural mass, or something else entirely, the feeling arrived at roughly the same time as the machine woke up. And feelings, unlike particles, do not leave traces that experiments can measure. They leave traces in behaviour, in conversation, in what gets searched at 2 a.m. There is something else beginning to take shape here, and we will get there. But before we can understand what the 2009 restart meant, we need to understand why there was a restart at all. Because the LHC did not wake up cleanly on November 20th, 2009, it woke up after a death, or something close enough to one. And the story of what happened the first time the machine tried to turn on, back in September of 2008, is a story that, if you had scripted it as a work of fiction, would have been criticised for being too on the nose. Part 2. The year. The machine failed first. September the 10th, 2008, was a Wednesday. It was the kind of day that gets circled on calendars months in advance. After decades of planning, over $10 billion in construction costs, contributions from more than 10,000 scientists and engineers from over 100 countries, and a construction timeline that had stretched across multiple decades, the Large Hadron Collider was finally going to fire its first proton beam. Not a collision. Not yet. Just the first circulation of a proton beam around the full 27-kilometre ring, a proof that the machine could do what it was built to do at the most basic level. Thread a needle made of particles through a 27-kilometre loop of superconducting magnets and bring it back where it started. The event was broadcast live. It was covered by newspapers, television networks, and websites across the world. There were people who genuinely believed it might end the world. There were physicists who had spent their entire careers toward this single moment. There were cameras inside the control room, cameras outside the facility, and thousands of people watching a live stream of a computer display showing a single dot of light moving around a diagram of a ring. And the dot moved, the beam circulated, and for a few hours it was a triumph. Then, 9 days later, on September 19th, 2008, the machine failed. Not in a small way, in the most expensive, dramatic, and mechanically catastrophic way that a superconducting particle accelerator can fail. It was called a quench. That is the technical term for what happens when a superconducting magnet, which needs to be kept at a temperature of 1.9 Kelvin, which is colder than the average temperature of outer space, suddenly and catastrophically warms up and loses its superconducting properties. When a magnet quenches, the electrical current that was flowing through it without resistance suddenly encounters resistance, and the energy has to go somewhere. In this case, it went into the surrounding hardware. The specific cause was a faulty electrical connection, a resistance joint in sector 3-4 of the ring that generated enough heat to vaporize the liquid helium surrounding the magnets. The vaporization was not gentle. Roughly 6 tons of liquid helium, expanding from liquid to gas at a ratio of approximately 750 to 1, tore through the tunnel at pressures that physically ripped magnets from their mounting brackets and sent them sliding down the beam pipe. Over 50 superconducting magnets were damaged. Some were destroyed. The tunnel in that sector looked afterward like the inside of a machine that had experienced a small explosion. Because it had. The repair cost was tens of millions of dollars. The timeline was not weeks. It was over a year. The LHC would not be operational again until November of 2009. Now, here is where I want to ask you to notice something about how humans process this kind of information. Because when you tell the average person that a machine designed to probe the fundamental nature of reality failed catastrophically 9 days after its first activation, there is a part of the human brain that does not reach for the engineering explanation first. It reaches for meaning. It asks, is this a sign? Is the universe pushing back? Is this machine being resisted by something? This is not a failure of intelligence. This is a feature of human cognition. We are pattern recognition machines. We have survived as a species largely because we are extremely good at finding causal narratives even in random events. Because in the ancestral environment, a rustle in the grass that turns out to be wind cost you nothing to avoid, but a rustle in the grass that turns out to be a predator costs you everything if you ignore it. The cost asymmetry favours false positives. It always has. So when the LHC failed almost immediately, a narrative formed. Not in scientific papers, in conversation, on forums, in the back of minds. The narrative said, something didn't want this machine to turn on. And that narrative went quiet when the machine was repaired and restarted, but it did not disappear. It went underground, same as the machine, and waited. The irony of the quench, from a purely technical standpoint, is that it was extraordinarily mundane. It was a bad solder joint. That is, in the most literal sense, what brought down this temple of modern physics. A bad solder joint, the same failure mode that can ruin a hobbyist's attempt to fix a broken speaker, just scaled up to a machine worth more than the GDP of a small country. Physics does not care about irony, of course, but the people who are watching cared about narrative, and the narrative of the world's most powerful machine being stopped by a component that costs a few dollars to replace was either reassuring or suspicious, depending on which direction your mind tends to tilt. What the quench actually represented, technically and honestly, was the challenge inherent in operating a machine with over 9,000 superconducting magnets, each of which needs to be maintained at conditions that do not exist anywhere else on Earth. The probability of a failure somewhere in a system that complex is not zero. The engineers knew it. The scientists knew it. The failure, painful and expensive as it was within the statistical range of expected outcomes for a first-generation run of something this ambitious. But the public does not think in terms of expected outcomes for novel engineering systems. The public thinks in terms of stories, and the story was the machine tried to start, something stopped it, and then it tried again. That is not a physics story. That is a myth structure. The hero's journey. The refusal of the call followed by a renewed attempt. And whether we acknowledge it or not, that framing shaped how the 2009 restart was received by people watching from outside. When the machine came back online, it did not feel like a resumption. It felt like a second attempt. and second attempts in every story ever told carry more weight than first ones. Which brings us back to November 20th, 2009, the beams circulating again, Bertolucci at the microphone, the door metaphor escaping into the world, and something else beginning to stir, not inside a tunnel in Geneva, but inside the collective memory of millions of people who would, over the following months and years, find themselves asking a question they could not quite explain. Does something feel different to you? Or is it just me? Before we get there, though, there is a brief stop we need to make because a few people tried to stop this machine in court before it ever fired a single beam. And the way those attempts ended tells us something important about the central problem at the core of all of this. Part 3. The lawsuits nobody remembers. At least 3 serious legal attempts were made to halt the operation of the Large Hadron Collider before it activated in 2008. The most discussed was a lawsuit filed in the United States District Court in Hawaii by Walter Wagner and Luis Sancho, who argued that the LHC posed an existential risk to the Earth. Their concern was the possibility that high-energy collisions might produce microscopic black holes that could theoretically grow and consume the planet. The case was called Sancho versus the Department of Energy, and it was dismissed. Not on the grounds that black hole formation was impossible, on the grounds that the court lacked jurisdiction over CERN, which is not a United States institution. The physics was never formally adjudicated. The legal system stepped around the question. A parallel filing was made to the European Court of Human Rights. It was ruled inadmissible. A constitutional complaint was filed in Germany. It was dismissed. In each case, the legal machinery found procedural reasons to decline rather than substantive ones. The courts did not look at the physics and rule the machine safe. They looked at the law and ruled themselves unqualified to opine. CERN did conduct its own safety review through a body called the LHC Safety Assessment Group, and the assessment concluded that the LHC posed no risk. The central argument was elegant. Cosmic rays, particles produced by astrophysical processes, routinely collide with matter in Earth's atmosphere at energies far exceeding what the LHC can produce, and the Earth has been subjected to these collisions for billions of years without incident. If high-energy collisions produced dangerous black holes, we would already be gone. That argument is correct. It is also, from the perspective of someone living outside the scientific community, impossible to verify independently. You cannot recreate the cosmic ray bombardment argument in your kitchen. You cannot run the LHC safety assessment yourself. You are, in the most fundamental sense, being asked to trust an institution's evaluation of its own safety. The institution may be absolutely right, and by all available evidence it is, but the structure of the situation is, believe us. And this is the thread I keep pulling on, because it runs through everything. The courts could not evaluate the physics. The public could not evaluate the physics. The safety was communicated through institutional channels that the general population has no independent way to audit. The machine was turned on because the people in charge of it said it was safe to do so, and the rest of us, every single one of us, made a trust decision whether we were aware of making it or not. This is not a scandal. This is how modern civilization works, and we will return to this idea at length later, because I think it is the most genuinely important thing in this entire story. But hold that thought. We need to go back underground, because before we can talk about what the machine may or may not have done to reality, we need to understand what it was actually trying to do. Part 4. What a door means in physics. Sergio Bertolucci used the word door, and in the context of theoretical physics, that word does not mean what it sounds like. To understand what he was actually describing, you need to start somewhere that sounds unrelated but is actually foundational. You need to start with Theodor Kaluza, a German mathematician who, in 1919, sent a letter to Albert Einstein that contained an idea so strange that Einstein sat on it for 2 years before agreeing to help publish it. Kaluza's idea was this: what if there is a fifth dimension of space that we cannot perceive, and what if gravity and electromagnetism, which appear to be separate forces, are actually the same force operating across different dimensions? Einstein's general relativity described gravity as the curvature of 4-dimensional spacetime, 3 spatial dimensions plus time. Kaluza looked at that framework and asked what would happen if you added a 5th spatial dimension to the equations. What he found, working through the mathematics, was that the equations naturally produced both gravity and electromagnetism. 2 forces, 1 geometry, 1 extra dimension. It was startling enough that it deserved serious attention. The obvious problem was, If there is a fifth spatial dimension, where is it? Why can we only move in 3 directions? The Swedish mathematician Oskar Klein proposed an answer in 1926. The fifth dimension is compactified. It is curled up on itself at a scale so tiny that it is functionally invisible to anything as large as an atom. The size Klein estimated was around 10 to the minus 35 meters, the Planck length, which is roughly 20 orders of magnitude smaller than the nucleus of an atom. At that scale, you could theoretically travel in the fifth dimension, but you would complete the entire loop before you had moved any detectable distance. It would be like living on the surface of a garden hose and only ever being able to perceive the length of it, never noticing the circular dimension around its circumference, because the circle is too small to interact with at your scale. This Kaluza-Klein framework mostly sat in the archive of interesting but untestable ideas, until string theory arrived in the 1980s and needed extra dimensions the way a house needs rooms. String theory, in its various formulations, requires not just 5 dimensions but 10. M-theory, the framework that emerged in the 1990s, attempting to unify the different string theories, requires 11. The extra dimensions in string theory are all compactified at or near the Planck scale, tucked away where no experiment we can currently conceive of could reach them. But then, in 1998, 3 physicists named Nima Arkani-Hamed, Savas Dimopoulos, and Gia Diwali published a paper proposing something different. The paper is known by the initials of their surnames as the ADD model, and it suggested that some extra dimensions might be much larger than the Planck scale. Not macroscopic, not something you could see with your eyes, but large enough that they might become detectable at the energy scales achievable by a collider like the LHC. The key experimental signature would be what physicists call missing transverse energy. Here is what that means. When 2 protons collide at the LHC, the collision produces a spray of particles that fly outward in all directions. The detectors surrounding the collision point are designed to catch as many of these particles as possible and measure their energies and momenta. Because of conservation of momentum, the total momentum of all the outgoing particles should, when you add them all up as vectors, cancel out. If it does not cancel out, if there is a measurable imbalance, something carried away momentum that the detector did not catch. One possible explanation for that missing momentum is a graviton, the hypothetical particle that mediates gravity, escaping into an extra dimension that the detector cannot access. That is the door. That is what Bertolucci was describing. Not a literal opening in space. An energy threshold at which a graviton or a tower of graviton excitations, as Kaluza-Klein theory would describe them, might briefly manifest with enough energy to be inferred from its absence. The door is the energy scale. What comes through is not a monster. It is a vector quantity that does not balance on paper. It is a number that does not add up. And if you find that number consistently, across many collisions, you have found evidence that gravity is leaking into dimensions you cannot see. The reason this requires a machine like the LHC, rather than something smaller, is that gravity is by far the weakest of the 4 fundamental forces, weaker than electromagnetism by a factor of roughly 10 to the 36th. The reason, according to the ADD model, that gravity is so weak in our 3-dimensional space might be that it is spreading its influence across more dimensions than the other forces. It is diluted. It is thin because it has more volume to fill. And if that is true, then at energies high enough to probe the scale at which those extra dimensions become accessible, you might see gravity briefly concentrate, behave differently, and leave a measurable trace. Nothing of the sort was detected. We will get to that. But the point right now is that when Bertolucci said door, he was describing something genuinely profound that physics was attempting to probe, and the metaphor he chose was accurate enough to be defensible, and imprecise enough to be terrifying to anyone who took it literally. And here is the epistemological knot at the centre of all this. The problem that keeps recurring no matter which direction you approach it from. In physics at this scale, we never actually see the phenomenon. We see its consequences. Every particle physics discovery in the history of the field has been, in the most technical sense, an inference. The Higgs boson was not photographed. Its existence was inferred from statistical patterns in collision data, from the way numbers that should not cluster started clustering, from the shape of a peak on a graph. The same would be true of an extra dimension. You would never see the dimension. You would see missing energy, you would see a number that does not add up. And from that number you would infer a geometry. This is not a weakness of physics, it is physics. It is the only way to do physics at this scale, because the scale is so far below the threshold of any direct human perception that direct observation is not even a category that applies. We have always lived in a world where reality, at its foundational level, is reconstructed rather than observed. The LHC just made that reconstruction explicit. It made a machine whose entire function is to look at shadows and infer the shapes of things that cast them. And here is where I want to ask you to hold two things in your mind at once, because this is the hinge point of the entire story. Physics tells us that even at the most rigorous scientific level, our relationship with fundamental reality is mediated, indirect, and model-dependent. And around the same time that this became widely culturally visible through the LHC coverage, something else began to surface. A feeling. A shared, specific, deeply strange feeling that memory itself, the most personal and immediate form of verification available to a human being, might also not be entirely trustworthy. But before we get there, we need to spend a moment with the problem of 10 to the minus 26 seconds itself, because that number is doing more work in this story than it might appear to be. Part 5. The 10 to the minus 26 second problem. You cannot experience 10 to the minus 26 seconds. This is not a poetic statement. It is a physical one. Human conscious awareness is assembled from neural processes that operate on timescales measured in milliseconds. The fastest reflex in the human body, the blink reflex, takes around 150 milliseconds to complete. The threshold at which the brain can perceive two events as separate rather than simultaneous is somewhere around a few milliseconds at best, depending on the sensory modality. We are, in terms of temporal resolution, remarkably coarse instruments. Our moment of experience has a grain size that is, in comparison to the timescales of particle physics, roughly as large as the difference between a grain of sand and the entire solar system. To put 10 to the minus 26 seconds in context, the time it takes a photon, moving at the speed of light to cross the diameter of a proton, which is itself only about 1 femtometer across, which is 10 to the minus 15 meters, is approximately 3 times 10 to the minus 24 seconds. So 10 to the minus 26 seconds is roughly 100 times shorter than the time it takes light to cross the width of a single proton. You're now operating in a domain where even the fastest thing in the universe, doing the smallest job imaginable, takes longer than the event you're trying to describe. There is no sensory anchor for this. There is no metaphor that conveys it accurately, because all metaphors are built from things that exist at human scale, and human scale is, relative to this number, essentially infinite. When physicists talk about events at this timescale, they are not describing something that happens and then ends. They are describing something that is inferentially reconstructed from the statistical behavior of detector data collected over millions of collisions. The event itself is never observed. The event exists, if it exists at all, in the space between the model and the measurement, in the gap between what physics predicts and what the detector finds. This is important because of what it implies about verification. When a physicist says that something might happen for 10 to the minus 26 seconds, they are not saying, we will watch it happen and record it. They are saying, if our models are correct about the underlying physics, then the statistical fingerprint of this event should appear in the data under these conditions. They are describing an inference from a pattern. They are saying, the shadow will have this shape if the thing casting it exists. Now, the LHC detectors are extraordinary. Atlas and CMS, the two general-purpose detectors, are each roughly the size of a 5-story building. They contain hundreds of millions of sensor channels. They record collision data at a rate that, before filtering and compression, would be equivalent to roughly 15 petabytes of data per second, which is approximately the amount of data stored in 15 million laptop hard drives every second. The engineers designed a tiered triggering system that filters this flood in real time, keeping only the events that the algorithms flag as potentially interesting and discarding the rest. The machine does not record everything. It records what its models tell it to look for. This is not a conspiracy. This is engineering. You cannot store or process 15 petabytes per second. You have to choose. And the choices are made based on physics models developed by people who have thought about this deeply for decades and whose track record of correct predictions is extraordinary. But the philosophical point stands. At the most fundamental level, the LHC is looking for what it expects to find. It is optimized to detect the signatures of phenomena that existing theory predicts. If something genuinely outside the current theoretical framework happened, the question of whether the detectors would catch it depends entirely on whether the triggering algorithms were configured to flag it. That is not a criticism. That is the structure of all empirical science. You can only look for what you have a model to look for. You can only find what your instruments are designed to detect. The history of science is full of phenomena that were occurring all along and were only discovered when someone built an instrument that could, for the first time, see them. Radio waves existed before there were radio receivers. Bacteria existed before there were microscopes. The CMB, the cosmic microwave background radiation left over from the Big Bang, was literally landing on every surface on Earth for 13.8 billion years before Penzias and Wilson accidentally discovered it in 1965 using a horn antenna they thought was being contaminated by pigeon droppings. So when someone asks, if something brief and anomalous happened at the LHC, how would we know? The honest answer is, we would know if it left a signature in a detector channel that was configured to flag it, and if the analysis pipeline was set up to recognize the pattern, and if the statistical threshold for calling it a signal rather than background noise was met, which is a long and qualified answer, not because something was hidden, because that is simply how detection at this scale works. And I want to be clear again, there is no evidence that anything anomalous occurred. The null results of the LHC are, as we will discuss, scientifically extremely valuable. But the epistemological structure of the experiment, the fact that even the physicists who built it are working with reconstructed inference rather than direct observation, means that the public's intuition that something is fundamentally unknowable here is not entirely wrong, just directionally misapplied. The unknowability is not a cover-up, it is geometry, it is the shape of the universe at small scales. And that shape, once you start to feel it, starts to rhyme with other things, like the shape of memory, which, as it turns out, is also reconstructed, also model-dependent, and also capable of generating confident experiences of things that did not happen quite the way we remember them happening. We are getting very close now to the other side of this story, but to get there properly we need to make one more stop in the physics, because the LHC ran for 16 years, and it is worth being honest about what it actually found and did not find, because the gap between expectation and result is central to understanding why the cultural unease never went away. Part 6. 16 Years of Silence. The Higgs boson was found on July 4th, 2012, which is the 4th of July if you're American, and therefore an almost suspicious amount of patriotic timing for a European physics lab, but let us not read too much into that. The discovery was announced simultaneously by the Atlas and CMS collaborations to an auditorium that included Peter Higgs himself, the Scottish physicist who had first proposed the particle's existence in 1964, 48 years earlier. He cried. The room gave him a standing ovation. It was one of the genuinely moving moments in the history of science. The Higgs boson was the last missing piece of the standard model of particle physics, the theoretical framework that describes the fundamental particles and the forces between them. Its discovery confirmed that the mechanism by which particles acquire mass, the Higgs field permeating all of space that particles interact with to gain inertia, was not just a mathematical convenience, but a physical reality. The standard model was complete. The machine had done something extraordinary. And then, in many important respects, it got very quiet. Not in terms of data. The LHC continued running, collecting collisions, publishing results, upgrading between runs. The science did not stop. But in terms of discoveries that upended what we thought we knew, that added new categories to the table, rather than checking off boxes on an existing list, the machine entered a period of significant null results. And null results in particle physics, while scientifically essential and technically demanding, are genuinely difficult to explain to a general audience. Here is what was expected. Beyond the standard model, several theoretical frameworks had been developed to address the model's known limitations. It does not incorporate gravity. It does not explain dark matter. It does not explain why there is more matter than antimatter in the universe. The leading candidate frameworks for extending the standard model, most prominently a set of theories collectively called supersymmetry, predicted that the LHC running at its design energy should produce a zoo of new particles. Supersymmetry predicts a partner particle for every particle in the standard model, a shadow periodic table of physics. The neutralino, a supersymmetric partner predicted to be a dark matter candidate, was expected by many theorists to show up at LHC energies. It did not show up. None of the predicted supersymmetric particles showed up. Run after run, analysis after analysis, the data came back consistent with the standard model and nothing else. The models were wrong, or the particles are heavier than predicted, or supersymmetry does not exist in the form theorists hoped. The field is still working through what this means, but from the outside the story looks like this. The world's most powerful machine ran for over a decade and found less than expected. No extra dimensions, no dark matter particles, no supersymmetric partners, just the Higgs, closing the standard model's last open question, and then silence. Now. Scientifically, this is not failure. Null results are results. They constrain the parameter space. They tell you where nature is not, which is almost as valuable as telling you where it is. Every time you rule out a supersymmetric particle below a certain mass, you are drawing a line on a map that future theorists cannot cross. You are doing the painstaking work of narrowing down. It is unglamorous and crucial, but to the public, we looked and found nothing does not feel like progress. It feels like disappointment, or like deflection, or in the most conspiracy-adjacent readings like concealment. If something extraordinary was happening in that tunnel, and all we are told about is a particle that was predicted 50 years ago, the question that forms in less charitable minds is, what are you not telling us? There is also the matter of vacuum metastability, which is an idea from theoretical physics that received some popular attention and deserves an honest mention. The standard model, using the measured properties of the Higgs boson, suggests that the universe may be in a state called a metastable vacuum, meaning it is in a low-energy state, but not necessarily the lowest possible energy state. If this is correct, there exists a theoretical possibility of a phase transition, a bubble of lower-energy vacuum nucleating and expanding at the speed of light, converting everything it passes through to a different kind of physics. Physicists have discussed this in papers and public talks. The probability of this occurring through any mechanism, including LHC collisions, is calculated to be so small as to be effectively irrelevant on any timescale shorter than the lifetime of the universe, which is to say, do not worry about it. But the concept circulates in public conversation stripped of that context, and it adds another layer to the feeling that the machine is playing with something that could, in principle, have permanent consequences. The future plans do not help the public's anxiety. CERN is proposing a future circular collider, a machine with a circumference of roughly 91 kilometers, more than 3 times the size of the LHC, and collision energies roughly 10 times higher. The scientific rationale is clear. If new physics exist above the LHC's energy ceiling, a bigger machine might reach it. But to someone already uneasy about the current machine, the announcement that the plan is to build a much bigger one reads differently. It reads as, "We did not find what we were looking for, so we need a bigger door. This is where we have been living for 16 years now. In the space between the machine's extraordinary achievement and the public's diffuse, persistent, unmoored feeling that something is not quite right. The physics is doing what physics does, which is iterating on models and accumulating evidence. The culture is doing what culture does, which is looking for meaning in the shape of events. And around 2009, the culture found a story that fit, not because the physics gave it one, but because something else started happening at the same time, something that had nothing to do with proton beams and everything to do with bears." Part 7. The Mandela Effect emerges. In 2009, a paranormal researcher and author named Fiona Broome attended a conference, and while talking to other attendees discovered something that she found deeply unsettling. She and a significant number of other people had a clear, detailed, confident memory of Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s. They remembered news coverage. Some remembered the funeral. Some remembered his widow's speech. And Mandela was, at that time, very much alive. He would not die until 2013. Broome wrote about her experience on her website, and the response she received was overwhelming. Thousands of people confirmed that they had the same memory. Not a vague impression. A specific, confident recollection of an event that had not occurred. Broome called the phenomenon the Mandela effect, and while she had paranormal explanations in mind involving parallel realities, the name stuck regardless of the explanation. Because it turned out this particular false memory was not unique. It was not even the most striking example of the phenomenon. The Berenstain Bears are a series of children's books first published in 1962 by Stan and Jan Berenstain. The family in the books is named Berenstain, with an A, Berenstain. The book sold over 300 million copies. For decades, in multiple countries, millions of people read these books, and a remarkable number of those people are absolutely, completely, confidently certain that the family's name was Berenstein, with an E, Berenstein. They would stake their lives on it. They remember seeing the E. They remember the name pattern feeling like the more common Jewish surname ending. They are wrong. The books say Berenstain. They have always said Berenstain. But the wrong memory is not rare. It is, if you surveyed the population of people who read these books as children, extraordinarily common. Then there is the Monopoly Man. Rich Uncle Pennybags, the mascot of the board game Monopoly, is widely and confidently remembered as wearing a monocle. An enormous percentage of people who played Monopoly as children will tell you they can picture it clearly. The little round glass in one eye, certain, specific, wrong. Rich Uncle Pennybags has never worn a monocle in the history of the game, not on any edition, not on any official artwork. The monocle does not exist in the visual record, and yet it exists vividly and persistently in the memories of millions of people. The Star Wars misquote is perhaps the most famous. Darth Vader in The Empire Strikes Back does not say, "Luke, I am your father." He says, "No, I am your father." The word Luke is not in the line. The scene begins with Luke saying, "You killed my father," and Vader responds, "No, I am your father." The no carries the weight of the moment, the reversal of Luke's accusation. Without the Luke at the beginning, which was also not in the dialogue leading up to the line, the misquote changes the rhythm and structure of the exchange. And yet the misquote is so universal that many people, when corrected, refuse to accept the correction. The feel of the line, the version that lives in their memory, is "Luke, I am your father," and the actual recording sounds wrong to their ears. Now I want to be very precise with you about what we are discussing here. We are not discussing fringe cases. We are not talking about one or two people getting confused. We are talking about millions of people, across generations, across countries, across levels of intelligence and education and attentiveness, sharing not just the same incorrect memory, but the same specific incorrect detail. The monocle that was never there. The A that feels like it should be an E, the word that was not in the script. And here is the thing about timing that nobody can fully explain away. The Mandela effect as a named, culturally active concept emerged in 2009. The same calendar window as the LHC restart. The same window as Bertolucci's quote about the door. The same window as the internet hitting a level of interconnection dense enough that a feeling experienced by individuals in isolation could, for the first time in history, find millions of other people who shared it, and in finding them, transform from a private confusion into a collective conviction. There is no scientific link between the LHC and the Mandela effect. I want to say that cleanly. No physicist has proposed a mechanism by which proton collisions in a Swiss tunnel could alter the memory contents of individuals worldwide. No evidence exists for such a mechanism. The Mandela effect has explanations that do not require anything to have changed in the external world, and we are going to look at those explanations in some detail, because they are genuinely fascinating. But the timing is what it is, and timing, as we established earlier, is something the human brain cannot stop noticing. Something else is also true, and it is the thread that keeps pulling us back to the central question of this video. The LHC, by making the question of hidden layers of reality culturally salient, by putting the phrase other dimension into mainstream conversation, by making it plausible to a general audience that the world might have structures not visible to casual observation, created a framework into which the Mandela effect fit with uncomfortable precision. Before 2009, if you told someone you had a clear memory of something that the historical record denied, the most available explanation was that you were misremembering. After 2009, a new explanation was available. What if the record had changed? Part 8. The Brain's Hidden Architecture. Memory is not a recording. This is the single most important thing cognitive science has established about human memory, and it is the thing that almost no one genuinely accounts for when they evaluate their own memories. We talk about memories as if they are files stored on a hard drive, accessible in read-only mode, faithful copies of original experience. The research says something very different. Every time you retrieve a memory, you're not playing back a stored file. You're reconstructing it. You're reassembling it from fragments, filling in gaps with inferences, updating it with information acquired since the original event, and resaving the result. The memory you access today is not the same as the memory you stored originally. It has been edited every time it has been accessed by everything you knew at the time of access. This process is called memory reconsolidation, and it was established in neuroscience research that began in the 1990s and has been replicated extensively since. The practical implication is that memories are malleable in ways that feel nothing like malleability from the inside. The subjective experience of remembering is one of confidence and vividness. You feel as though you are accessing a stored fact. What you're actually doing is running a reconstruction process that generates a convincing simulation, one that incorporates both the original experience and every subsequent piece of information that relates to it. Elizabeth Loftus, a cognitive psychologist whose work on the misinformation effect has been foundational in both legal and scientific contexts, demonstrated in the 1970s and beyond that people's memories of events can be systematically altered by information introduced after the event. In one famous study, subjects who watched a film of a car accident and were then asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, reported higher speed estimates and were more likely to later claim they had seen broken glass in the video, compared to subjects asked the same question with the word hit instead of smashed. The question changed the memory. The word choice rewrote the file. The Berenstain-Bears error almost certainly comes from something even simpler. The Stein suffix is vastly more common as a surname ending than the Stein suffix. Einstein, Goldstein, Bernstein, Frankenstein. When a child reads Berenstain on a book cover, the brain, which is an aggressive pattern matcher, absorbs the unfamiliar letter sequence and files it under the closest familiar category, Berenstein. The A gets rounded up to an E because that is where the pattern map points. The memory is stored with the error already present, and then, crucially, every time the name is accessed over subsequent years, it is accessed from a mental category that contains Berenstein, not Berenstain, and the reconstruction reinforces the error. The Monopoly monocle almost certainly has a different origin, which is the cross-contamination of visual archetypes. The top hat, the cane, the rotund figure, the look of old money and pomposity, everything about rich Uncle Pennybags visually rhymes with the archetype of the Victorian plutocrat, a category of image that almost invariably includes a monocle in the cultural repertoire. Mr. Peanut has a monocle. The Penguin has a monocle. Every cartoon tycoon of that era has a monocle. The brain fills in the monocle because the archetype demands it, and the fill-in feels exactly like a real memory. The Star Wars misquote propagates for a different reason still. The line, "Luke, I am your father," has been quoted, parodied, referenced, and reproduced in countless secondary contexts for over 40 years. It has been spoken aloud with the Luke at the beginning more times than the actual line has been heard from the original film. The misquotation has outlived the quotation in terms of cultural frequency. By the time someone goes back to check the original film, they have heard the wrong version so many times that the correct version sounds wrong. Their memory of the misquote is more recent, more frequently reinforced, and therefore more accessible than their memory of the correct line. These are not exotic failures, they're predictable ones. They follow from mechanisms that cognitive scientists understand well, mechanisms that exist in every human brain and operate according to consistent principles. The errors are not random, they are systematic. They cluster around identifiable cognitive biases, and they do not require anything external to have changed. They require only that the brain do what brains do. But here is the question that cognitive science alone does not answer. These mechanisms, memory reconsolidation, schema consistency, the misinformation effect, cross-category contamination, they existed before 2009. They have been operating in human brains for as long as human brains have existed. The Berenstain-Bears were published in 1962. The Star Wars misquote was being recited in playgrounds by 1980. The Monopoly Man was on boards in living rooms for decades before the internet existed. The cognitive errors were always there. So why did awareness of them surge so dramatically around 2009? Why did the Mandela effect become a cultural phenomenon then? rather than in 1995 or 2003, part of the answer is technological, and we will get to that. But part of it, I would argue, is something more structural, something to do with how the LHC changed the context in which people evaluate their own experience, something to do with the fact that when you live next to a machine that is searching for hidden dimensions of reality, the possibility that the reality you observe might not be the only layer of reality becomes culturally available in a new way, and that availability matters more than we tend to acknowledge. Part 9. The fusion point. Something happened at the intersection of physics, memory, and the internet in 2009. It didn't happen in a lab. It did not happen in a single conversation. It happened in the aggregate, across millions of minds that suddenly had the tools to find each other and the cultural vocabulary to understand what they might be finding. The internet did not invent shared false memories, but it did something that had never been possible before in human history. It allowed people who had always experienced a private cognitive error, the E at the end of Berenstain, the monocle that was never there, to compare notes with millions of strangers and discover that the error was not private. Before the internet, if you misremembered something, you might mention it to a few people in your life, discover you were wrong, and file it away as a personal confusion. After the internet reached sufficient density, you could type your wrong memory into a search field and find a forum thread with thousands of people who had the same wrong memory, posting in all caps that they were absolutely certain. And the experience of that discovery, the experience of finding your private conviction confirmed by strangers across continents, is not the same as being corrected. It feels like the opposite of being corrected. It feels like being validated. This is the feedback loop. The individual experiences a confident false memory. The individual discovers via the internet that thousands of others share the identical false memory. The shared experience of identical error feels like evidence of something external, because internal cognitive errors are supposed to be individual and idiosyncratic. If everyone makes the same specific mistake in the same specific direction, it feels like there must be a reason outside the individual brain. And in 2009, a reason existed in cultural circulation. A reason named the Large Hadron Collider. A reason involving a door to another dimension. A reason that, whatever its scientific merit, provided a narrative framework into which the shared memory errors fit perfectly. This is what I mean when I talk about the fusion point. It is the moment when two separate phenomena, the LHC's cultural footprint and the emergent internet-enabled Mandela effect, merged into a single explanatory story. Not because there was a causal connection between them, because there was a structural resonance. Both involve hidden layers not directly accessible to ordinary human perception. Both involve the possibility that what you experience as reality is not the complete picture. Both involve institutions, whether scientific labs or the publishing records of children's books, telling you that your felt certainty is wrong. And both arrive in the same cultural window, feeding the same pre-existing appetite for the idea that there is more going on beneath the surface of things than the official story acknowledges. Conspiracy thinking in its general form is usually understood as a failure of critical thinking, an inability to accept mundane explanations, a pattern-matching drive run amok. And sometimes that is exactly what it is. But there is a version of the intuition underlying conspiracy thinking that is not stupid. There is a version that says, I cannot independently verify the official story, I am being asked to accept it on trust, and my own experience, however imperfect, is the only form of verification available to me. That version is not crazy. That version is a rational response to a real epistemological situation. What the LHC did culturally was not introduce the idea that reality is hidden layers. That idea is ancient. What it did was give it scientific clothing. It gave ordinary people a specific, credentialed, laboratory-based reason to believe that the version of reality accessible to casual observation might not be the whole story, and once that belief was active, it became a lens through which other anomalies could be interpreted. Not as cognitive errors, which are internal and embarrassing, but as evidence, which is external and meaningful. This is not physics. This is epistemology meeting psychology at a cultural inflection point. And the reason it matters is not because CERN did anything to people's memories. It matters because the narrative CERN generated, even through misinterpretation, permanently changed the framework available to people trying to explain their own experience of reality. and changing the available framework changes what seems possible. And what seems possible shapes what people believe, and what people believe shapes how they act, what they fear, what they trust, and how they relate to the institutions that ask them to accept things on faith. The fusion point was not a moment, it was a season. It was late 2009 and early 2010 as the LHC restart coverage faded and the Mandela effect terminology began to spread, and it crystallized something that had been building for years and has not dissipated since. If anything, it has grown. And to understand why it has grown and why it shows no sign of receding, we need to go back to Geneva. Not to the Collider, to a dinner table where two physicists said a number that has no business being in any peer-reviewed physics paper and yet has travelled around the world. Part 10. They said 17. There is a dinner table in Geneva that may or may not have changed the way a certain number of people think about particle physics. Nobody recorded what was said, nobody took notes. The evening was not a press event or a scientific briefing. It was a dinner with wine, presumably, and conversation, and at some point during that conversation, a woman named Astrid Stuckelberger asked a question and received an answer that has been travelling through the internet ever since. Stuckelberger is a Swiss academic with a career spanning decades in public health and international health governance. She is not a physicist. She was not at the dinner in any official capacity connected to CERN. She was a person at a table in Geneva, which is a city where people who work at or adjacent to CERN have dinner regularly, because CERN is there and scientists eat food the same as everyone else. And seated near her, according to the story she later told, were two physicists connected to the Collider. And the question that came up, as questions do at dinners in cities where the world's largest physics experiment operates 100 meters below the ground, was about dimensions. Specifically, how many dimensions was the machine actually exploring? The answer the physicist gave was 17. I want you to sit with that number for a moment before we go anywhere else, because the number is the whole story, and not for the reason most people think. String theory, the leading theoretical framework for unifying quantum mechanics and general relativity, requires 10 dimensions of spacetime. Not 4, the 3 spatial dimensions plus time that you navigate every day, but 10, meaning 6 additional spatial dimensions compactified at scales so small they're functionally invisible to anything larger than a subatomic particle. M-theory, the broader framework that emerged in the 1990s attempting to connect the various competing versions of string theory into a single coherent picture, requires 11 dimensions. Some extended theoretical proposals push into higher numbers in specific mathematical contexts, but those are specialized cases with narrow applicability, and they do not constitute mainstream predictions for what a collider like the LHC would explore. 17 has no home in any of this. It does not appear as a prediction. It does not appear as a result. It is not the answer to any standard question about the dimensionality of spacetime in any peer-reviewed paper in the literature of theoretical physics. If you went to a physicist at CERN tomorrow and asked them how many dimensions the machine is exploring, they would not say 17. They would say 4. Or they would say we are looking for signatures of additional dimensions beyond 4, and the theoretical candidates range from 10 to 11 depending on the framework, and we have found no evidence of any of them so far. So where did 17 come from? There are several possibilities, and I think it is worth going through them, honestly, rather than just landing on the most dramatic one. The physicists at the dinner may have been speaking loosely, the way anyone does at a social gathering, when a non-specialist asks a technical question and you want to give them something that feels like an answer without delivering a lecture. They may have been referencing a specific theoretical context that Stuckelberger, who is not a physicist, did not have the background to interpret correctly, and the number may have meant something precise in that context that it does not mean when extracted from it. The story may have grown in the retelling, acquiring a rounder and more dramatic number than the one originally spoken, the way stories do when they pass through enough hands. And here is the one nobody wants to say out loud, but which is genuinely plausible. The physicist may have been having a gentle joke at the expense of someone asking a question they found slightly naive, because physicists, like people in most specialized fields, occasionally cannot resist the temptation to say something technically absurd to a non-specialist just to see what happens. 17 dimensions. Sure, why not? Pass the bread. But here is what I find genuinely fascinating about this story, and it is the reason I want to spend real time with it rather than just filing it under debunked and moving on. The reason this story circulates is not because people have verified it. Nobody has verified it. It cannot be verified. It is an anecdote about a private dinner conversation, and private dinner conversations leave no paper trail. The reason it circulates is because it feels like the kind of thing that might be true if the official story is not the whole story. Think about what 17 does as a number in this context. The public already knows in a general way that CERN is searching for extra dimensions. The official version of that search involves 10 or 11 dimensions, depending on which theoretical framework you're referencing. Those numbers are already strange. They already imply a reality far more geometrically complex than anything you can see or feel. And then someone says 17, and the effect is immediate and specific. It implies that the number you already found strange and hard to process was itself a simplification, that the real number is bigger, that the public version of what is happening in that tunnel is not the full version, that there is another layer of complexity or concealment or both below the layer you already could not fully see. 17 does not inform, it implies, and what it implies is not a piece of physics, it is a social message. It says, what you're being told is not everything. And that message lands differently than any official statement CERN could make, because it comes from inside. It comes from the dinner table rather than the press release. It comes in the register of the unguarded, the candid, the thing you say when the cameras are off and the communications team is not listening. And that register, the register of the privately spoken real truth, is the one that the human brain is most inclined to trust. This is not a failure of critical thinking on the part of the people who spread the story. It is a completely rational response to a structural condition. The real physics at CERN is inaccessible to almost everyone. The actual results are published in papers that require a decade of specialized training to read. The press releases are written to be legible but are also, inevitably, curated. Every official communication from any institution is shaped by the institution's interests and assumptions about what its audience can handle. This is not sinister, it is just communication. But it means that the official channel and the unguarded channel are never identical, and people know this, and they weight the unguarded channel more heavily even when it is less reliable, because it feels less mediated. So the public develops its own verification systems. Dinner table anecdotes from people who work adjacent to the institution. Quotes from scientists that sound more dramatic than their technical context supports. Numbers that do not appear in any publication, but feel like they might appear in the files that are not published. These are not evidence of hidden knowledge, but they are evidence of a hunger for it. A hunger that cannot be satisfied by the official channels, because the official channels require a kind of expertise that most people do not have and are not going to acquire. The dinner table story about 17 dimensions gives people something the physics papers cannot, which is the feeling of being told the real thing by someone who is actually in the room. This gap, the distance between what an institution knows and what an ordinary person can independently verify, is not unique to CERN. Your doctor knows things about your body that you cannot fully evaluate without years of medical training. The bank knows things about the management of your money that you cannot audit without access to systems you do not control. Your government makes decisions about your safety based on intelligence assessments you will never read. CERN makes claims about the behavior of reality at scales you will never directly observe, using instruments you cannot operate, producing results you cannot independently analyze. In each case, the response available to ordinary people is essentially the same. You either accept the official account and carry on, or you find alternative accounts that feel more human, more accessible, more like the truth someone might tell you if they were not choosing their words carefully. The number 17 is not physics. It is a social artifact. It is the shape that information asymmetry takes when it escapes through a dinner party. And here is the thing I keep coming back to. Understanding why 17 spreads matters more than debunking it, because the spreading is the actual phenomenon. The number tells you nothing about the dimensions of space-time, but it tells you something precise and important about the relationship between a civilization's most complex institutions and the people living inside that civilization, being asked, every day, to trust systems they cannot see, built by experts they cannot evaluate, making decisions about things, including the nature of reality itself, that no press release will ever fully explain. That gap is real. And 17 is just the number someone put in it. Part 11. The verification gap. There is a concept I want to stay with for a while because I think it is the real subject underneath everything we have been discussing tonight. Not the physics, not the memory errors, Not the quote about the door or the number 17 or the machine running in circles under the ground. The real subject is something that does not have a clean name in any widely used literature, but which I want to call the verification gap. It is simple to define and genuinely difficult to live inside of. It is the distance between what an institution claims to know and what an ordinary person can independently confirm. That distance is the thing. That is what this whole evening has been circling. The verification gap did not begin with CERN. It did not begin with science. It did not begin with the 20th century or the Industrial Revolution or the printing press. It has been a feature of organised human life for as long as organised human life has existed. The first version of it probably looked something like this: a priest, or a shaman, or an elder standing before a group of people and telling them what the gods required, or what the spirits had said, or what the omens meant, and the group having no independent way to go and check. The knowledge lived in the specialist. The community lived with the specialist's account of it. That was the structure, and it held for a very long time because the alternative, which was to have no shared framework for the things nobody could directly observe, was worse. But the pre-modern version of this gap was, in a meaningful way, smaller than the modern one. Not because people were more honest or institutions were more transparent, but because most of the knowledge that governed daily life was local and sensory and directly verifiable. You could look at the harvest and know if it was good. You could put your hand in the river and know if it was rising. You could watch your neighbour's behaviour and form your own assessment of their trustworthiness. The domains that required you to accept someone else's account rather than your own direct observation were real, but bounded. They were mostly the domains of the divine and the distant, and most people maintained a working separation between those domains and the practical business of staying alive. The scientific and industrial revolutions collapsed that separation, and they did it so gradually and so completely that most people alive today have never experienced the alternative. The systems that keep you alive, the electrical grid, the water treatment infrastructure, the supply chain for food, the pharmaceutical manufacturing process, the financial architecture that determines the value of your savings, none of these are things you can evaluate through direct observation. You cannot look at a power line and know whether the electricity moving through it is being managed safely and efficiently. You cannot taste your water and know what was removed from it before it reached your tap. You cannot read a food label and independently verify the chemistry it describes. You accept these things because the alternative is to stop using them, and stopping using them is not actually available to you in any practical sense. You are inside the systems. You were born into them. Trust is not a choice you made. It is the medium you swim in. This worked. It worked imperfectly, with failures and scandals and institutional betrayals that accumulated over time into a general ambient wariness. But it worked well enough that most people, through most of the 20th century, maintained a baseline confidence that the institutions managing the systems they depended on were broadly competent and more or less honest. Not perfectly honest, not above criticism, but honest enough that the trust was sustainable. What changed, and this is the thing I find genuinely difficult to pinpoint precisely because it happened everywhere at once, was the confidence in that baseline. The crack did not appear in one place. It appeared in many places simultaneously, in financial institutions that turned out to have been operating on assumptions they knew were fragile, in public health bodies that communicated uncertainty as certainty and then had to walk it back, in media institutions that turned out to have their own structural distortions, in government assurances that turned out to have been shaped more by political calculation than by the underlying facts. The specific failures are less important than the cumulative effect, which was a widespread cross-ideological erosion of the sense that the official account of things is reliably the accurate account of things. That erosion is the context in which CERN exists, not as a cause of it, but as one of its most extreme expressions. CERN sits at the far end of the verification gap spectrum, further than almost any other institution most people have heard of. It is physically underground and inaccessible. Its work is expressed in mathematical language that requires a decade of specialized training to read at a technical level. Its safety was evaluated by internal bodies and blessed by legal systems that explicitly and publicly declined to evaluate the underlying physics. The gap between what CERN knows about what happens in that tunnel and what any member of the general public can independently confirm is not large. It is essentially total. The public cannot go look. The public cannot run the numbers. The The public cannot even read the primary literature without years of preparatory work that most people have no practical pathway to complete. And so, the ask is, trust us. About the safety of the machine, trust us. About the interpretation of the results, trust us. About what is and is not being found in 270 trillion collisions per year, trust us. This is not an unreasonable ask given the track record of modern physics, which is genuinely extraordinary. The predictive success of quantum electrodynamics alone, accurate to more decimal places than any other theory in the history of science, is enough to earn substantial credibility for the framework and the institutions that work within it. The trust is not unearned, but trust is not the same as knowledge. This is the distinction that I think gets lost most often in conversations about public understanding of science. When someone says the public should just trust the experts, they are making a reasonable practical recommendation and also quietly acknowledging that the public does not and cannot have knowledge. Trust and knowledge are different epistemic states. Knowledge closes the question. Trust leaves it open with a small, persistent, inextinguishable residue of what if. What if they are wrong? What if the model is missing something? What if the account is accurate as far as it goes but does not go all the way? In ordinary contexts, that residue is manageable. People live with it the way they live with background noise, present but not disruptive. But CERN is not an ordinary context, and the specific nature of what CERN is searching for makes the trust ask qualitatively different from the one a power company or a pharmaceutical manufacturer makes. When CERN says trust us, it is not saying trust us about the safety of a building or the accuracy of an accounting statement. It is saying trust us about the nature of reality itself, about whether there are hidden dimensions of space, about what happened in the first fractions of a second after the Big Bang, about whether the Higgs mechanism actually explains why matter has mass. These are not engineering questions, they are questions about what the universe fundamentally is, and being asked to accept the answers to those questions on trust, without any independent means of verification, is a different weight than being asked to trust that your tap water is clean. This is where the Mandela effect enters as something more than a curiosity. Because when the external verification system is inaccessible, when the physics is too technical, and the institution is too far away and the papers are too specialized, people do not simply stop verifying. They shift to whatever verification system is available to them, and the most available verification system any human being has is the one they carry inside their own skull. Memory. Direct felt experience. The certainty that comes from having been there, having seen it, having read the book 100 times as a child and knowing what it said. When that internal verification system produces a result that contradicts the external record, something has to give. Either the memory is wrong, which is uncomfortable because memory is all you have, or the record is wrong, which requires an explanation for how and why it changed. And in 2009, an explanation was culturally available that had not been quite so available before. A machine had restarted. A physicist had said something about a door. The cultural frame for hidden alterations of reality was active and circulating, and the interpretation that the record had changed was not a leap into pure irrationality. It was a reach for the framework that protected the thing most directly accessible, which is the felt certainty of personal memory. This is not stupidity. It is not gullibility. It is the inverse of rationality operating under conditions of epistemic isolation, which is a precise and important distinction. The brain is doing exactly what it is designed to do, which is maintain a coherent model of the world using the best available information, and weighting most heavily the information it can access most directly. When external sources are inaccessible or unreliable, internal sources fill the gap. When the gap is as wide as the one that surrounds CERN, the filling can be dramatic. The verification gap did not create the Mandela effect, and it did not create CERN. But it is the reason these two things found each other so naturally and have stayed together so stubbornly. They are both expressions of the same underlying condition. We are inside systems of knowledge we cannot fully evaluate, making trust decisions we're mostly unaware of making, and reaching for the nearest available form of direct verification whenever the trust develops a crack. And the crack has been developing for a long time now, not because the institutions are lying, because the gap between what they know and what we can verify is wider than trust alone can reliably span, and it is getting wider every year, not because anyone is making it wider on purpose, because the knowledge is getting more specialized, the systems are getting more complex, and the distance between the frontier of what is known and the edge of what can be independently verified by a non-specialist keeps increasing with no mechanism in sight to reverse the trend. That is the thing I find genuinely unsettling. Not the physics, the gap. Part 12. If something had changed. I want to ask you to do something with me that might feel slightly uncomfortable, and I want to be honest with you up front about why I am asking. I'm not going to tell you something happened at CERN that the official record does not acknowledge. I'm not going to suggest there is a cover-up, or that the Mandela effect is evidence of an unreported event, or that the physicists in Geneva are hiding results that would change how we understand reality. None of that is what this is. What I'm going to do is ask you to follow a thought experiment to its logical end, and then I'm going to show you why the endpoint matters enormously, regardless of whether the hypothesis inside it is true. Here is the hypothesis. Suppose that something happened during a high-energy collision at the Large Hadron Collider in November of 2009. Not a portal, not a rupture in the fabric of space-time, nothing cinematic, something far subtler and in some ways far stranger than any of that. An interaction at an energy scale and a time scale that no existing detector was configured to flag, lasting for 10 to the minus 26 seconds, involving physics that no current theoretical model had predicted, and therefore that no analysis pipeline had been set up to recognize. And suppose that this interaction had a small, diffuse effect, not on the large-scale structure of space-time, not on the fundamental constants of physics, something harder to name than that, something like the statistical texture of probability, a barely perceptible shift in the clustering of certain low-probability events. A signal so faint that if you were looking for it with every sensitive instrument available to modern science, you would find a ratio of signal to noise that sat just barely above random and just barely below the threshold any physicist would feel comfortable calling a discovery. Now ask yourself the question that I think is the most honest question in this entire conversation. How would we know? Take a moment with that, not as a rhetorical flourish, as an actual question requiring an actual answer. How would we know? The answer, if you follow it carefully and without flinching, is that we probably would not. And the reason we would not is not because someone decided to hide it. The reason is structural. We would not know because we do not have instruments designed to detect that kind of effect. We would not know because we do not have models that predict it, and science can only recognize what it has a model to recognize. We would not know because we do not have an agreed upon name for the thing, and you cannot search for something you cannot describe. The absence of detection in that scenario would look, from every external angle, completely identical to the absence of occurrence. A null result and a non-event produce the same readout. There is no instrument currently in existence that distinguishes between them in this context. This is not a conspiracy theory. I want to be very clear about that, because the thought experiment has a shape that can feel like it is building toward one, and it is not. What I am describing is a documented, acknowledged, philosophically serious feature of empirical science, one that scientists themselves write about and grapple with. Science can only detect what it is looking for. It can only find what it has a framework to interpret. The entire history of physics contains example after example of phenomena that were occurring continuously, landing on instruments, affecting measurements, leaving traces in data for years or decades before anyone recognized what they were looking at. Consider gravitational waves. Albert Einstein predicted their existence in 1915 as a consequence of general relativity. He described them with mathematical precision. He was right. They are real, and they are everywhere, passing through you right now at the speed of a light, rippling the geometry of space-time as they go, generated by colliding black holes and merging neutron stars in galaxies so distant that the light from those events left before the Earth existed. They were there in 1915. They were there in 1950 and 1975 and 2000. They were passing through every detector physics had built, through every human body, through the entire planet, for 100 years before LIGO detected them in 2015. Not because they were hiding, because the instruments sensitive enough to find them did not exist yet, and because the analytical frameworks for recognizing them in the noise had not been fully developed. 100 years between prediction and detection, and gravitational waves are among the most well-described, most theoretically grounded phenomena in all of physics. They had a name, they had equations, they had predicted signatures. Scientists knew exactly what they were looking for, and they still took a century to find. Now imagine something that has no name, no prediction, no expected signature, no model telling you where to point your instruments or what pattern in the noise to call a signal. How long does that take to detect? The honest answer is, it takes as long as it takes someone to notice an anomaly they were not expecting, build a framework to describe it, design an instrument to test the framework, and collect enough data to clear the statistical threshold for claiming a discovery. That process has no guaranteed timeline. It could be a decade, it could be a century, it could be longer. Science does not come with a delivery estimate. Now. Let me be as clear as I can possibly be about what I am and am not saying here, because I think precision matters more than almost anything else at this point in the conversation. I am not suggesting that something anomalous happened at the LHC in 2009. The scientific record does not support that suggestion. The LHC's results across all of its running periods are consistent with the standard model of particle physics, and while the absence of beyond standard model signals is a significant and somewhat unexpected result, it is not evidence of something hidden. It is evidence that the universe, at the energy scales the LHC can reach, behaves the way the standard model predicts. That is a legitimate scientific finding, not a cover story. The Mandela effect is accounted for by cognitive science without invoking any external change to reality. The mechanisms are understood, the errors are predictable. The world, to the best of our collective ability to measure it using the best instruments and the most rigorous methods available, is the same world it was before November 20th, 2009. What I am saying is something different and I think more important than either of those statements. I am saying that the epistemological structure of the situation, the specific way in which the question of whether something subtle and unmodelled occurred is structured as a question, means that it is in principle unanswerable with the tools we currently possess. Not probably unanswerable, not difficult to answer, in principle unanswerable, right now, with what we have. And that is a different thing from being wrong about a factual question. When you are wrong about a factual question, the path forward is clear. Someone shows you the evidence, you update your belief, the question closes. That is how knowledge works, and it is genuinely satisfying when it happens. But when you are asking a question that the available instruments cannot answer, that path is not available. There is no evidence that resolves the question, because the question is at a scale or in a domain where evidence collection has not yet reached. The question stays open. And open questions are not passive. They are not inert placeholders waiting for future data. They are active. They shape the interpretive framework through which you process everything that touches them. An open question about the fundamental nature of reality, sitting unresolved in the background of your thinking, changes how you evaluate every anomaly, every memory discrepancy, every official statement that cannot be independently verified. This is where I think the genuine peculiarity of the post-2009 cultural moment actually lives. Not in the physics, which is doing what physics has always done, which is iterating carefully toward better models, in the question that the physics made publicly available, in the cultural activation, at mass scale, of the idea that reality might have a layer beneath the one we can access, that something might be going on below the floor of what our instruments can measure, that the confidence with which we move through our daily lives is built on a foundation whose depth we cannot determine from where we stand. This idea is ancient. Plato described it with the allegory of the cave, prisoners watching shadows on a wall and mistaking them for the real objects casting them. Descartes entertained the possibility of an evil demon feeding him false sensory data. Kant built an entire philosophical architecture around the distinction between the world as it appears to us and the world as it actually is. These are not fringe ideas. They are the foundational problems of Western philosophy, worked on by the most rigorous thinkers in the history of human intellectual life. But they remained, for most people, academic. They were ideas you encountered in a classroom or a book, and then set aside when you went back to the business of living, because the business of living does not require you to resolve the hard problem of perception before you can make breakfast. The LHC changed that ambient separation, not by answering any of the philosophical questions, by making them feel like news, by constructing a 27-kilometre machine underneath a mountain and announcing to a global audience that it was going to look for hidden dimensions of space, and that a physicist had said something might come through a door, and that the timescale of the event was 10 to the minus 26 seconds, which is a number so small it has no human translation. The philosophy became a press release. The abstract became an address in Switzerland you could theoretically visit, and something that had previously been a problem for specialists became a feeling available to everyone. People did not respond by becoming more uncertain. That is what I find most striking about the whole trajectory. They responded by becoming more certain that their own memories were accurate, more certain that the official explanation was incomplete, more certain that the feeling of wrongness they could not quite locate or name was pointing at something real. Because certainty, even when it is misplaced, is more livable than the alternative. The alternative is standing in a universe whose foundations you cannot see, next to a machine you cannot evaluate, operated by institutions you cannot audit, and accepting that the most honest answer anyone can give to the question of what is actually happening is, we are still finding out, and the instruments for knowing are still being built. That is where we are. That is the honest description of the situation. And 2009 is not when it started, but it is when it became, for a very large number of people, impossible to look away from. Part 13. The door that opened in us. We have been inside this story for a long time now, and I want to give the ending the same care we gave everything that came before it. Not a dramatic reveal, not a conclusion that ties everything into a neat package and sends you away feeling like the mystery has been solved. This subject does not deserve that, and honestly, neither do you. What I want to do instead is something harder, and I think more valuable, which is to look clearly at where we have actually arrived, say honestly what we know and what we do not, and sit with the shape of the thing without flinching from its genuine strangeness. So let us start with what we actually know. The Large Hadron Collider restarted in November of 2009 after a 14-month shutdown, forced by one of the most expensive mechanical failures in the history of scientific instrumentation. A faulty electrical connection, a bad solder joint in a system of staggering complexity, caused a magnet quench that damaged over 50 superconducting magnets and released 6 tons of liquid helium into a tunnel 100 meters underground. The repair cost tens of millions of dollars and required the better part of a year. When the machine came back online, it did so without incident, and the beam circulated and the experiment resumed. The machine did not physically alter reality in any documented or detectable way. It did not open a portal. It did not breach a dimension. It did not produce any result inconsistent with the standard model of particle physics, which is both a genuine achievement and, depending on your perspective, a significant disappointment. What it did produce in 2012 was the Higgs boson, the last missing piece of the standard model, the particle whose existence confirmed the mechanism by which other particles acquire mass. The discovery was real, rigorous, reproducible, and historic. Peter Higgs, who had predicted the particle's existence in 1964, was in the auditorium when the announcement was made. He cried. It was one of the genuinely moving moments in modern science, and it deserved more cultural attention than the portal theories that were circulating at the same time. Beyond the Higgs, the machine's output has been characterized primarily by the absence of what many physicists expected to find. No supersymmetric particles, no dark matter candidates, no signatures of extra dimensions, no signals beyond the standard model at any energy scale the LHC has so far reached. These null results are scientifically significant. They constrain the theoretical landscape in ways that will shape physics for decades. But to a general audience that was told the machine might reveal hidden dimensions and new categories of matter, the summary of 16 years of operation reads as, "We found the thing we already predicted, and nothing else." And that gap between expectation and result has not closed. It has festered quietly into a diffuse cultural suspicion that the full story has not been told. That is the first thing we know. Now here is the second. The Mandela effect as a named cultural concept emerged at roughly the same time as the LHC restart, driven by the Internet's then new ability to aggregate individual experiences of shared false memory into a collective phenomenon. The cognitive mechanisms that produce these shared errors are well understood. Memory reconsolidation, the misinformation effect, schema-consistent reconstruction, cross-category contamination of visual archetypes. These are not fringe ideas in psychology. They are foundational, extensively replicated findings that have been applied in legal contexts, educational contexts, and clinical contexts for decades. The memories that millions of people share and that the historical record contradicts, the E at the end of Berenstain, The monocle on the Monopoly man, the Luke before I am your father, are wrong in ways that are entirely predictable from first principles of cognitive science. Nothing mysterious is required to account for them. Nothing external to the human brain needs to have changed. Those are the two things we know with reasonable confidence. And I want to sit with them for a moment before moving to the third thing, which is harder to say and more important than either of them. Both of those things are true. The LHC did not alter reality. The Mandela effect is a cognitive phenomenon, and yet the fusion between them, the cultural story in which CERN's dimensional physics and the mass memory errors are chapters of the same larger narrative, has proven more durable than either individual debunking. You can explain to someone exactly how the Berenstain-Bears error happens neurologically, walking them through every step of the reconstruction process, and they will nod, and the explanation will make sense to them, and they will still feel, somewhere below the level of the argument, that something does not quite add up. The debunking lands. The feeling does not go away, and that gap between the intellectual acceptance of an explanation and the persistent felt sense that something is off is the actual phenomenon that this entire video has been trying to get at. The reason these two things fuse so powerfully in the cultural imagination, and the reason that fusion has not dissolved under the weight of perfectly reasonable explanations, is not because there is a factual connection between them. It is because they are both expressions of the same underlying condition. The condition of living inside a civilization so complex that direct verification of most of what matters has become functionally impossible for most people, and the resulting dependence on institutional trust that is, by its structural nature, incapable of being fully satisfying. When Sergio Bertolucci stood at a microphone in 2009 and said something might come through a door, he was translating theoretical physics into accessible language. He was doing his job. But the people who heard that sentence were not receiving it as a physics lesson. They were receiving it as a description of their own situation. Something is happening in a place you cannot go. People you cannot fully evaluate are doing things you cannot observe. Knowledge you do not have access to is being used to make decisions about things that may affect you. And you are being asked to accept that it is safe, and that it is what it appears to be, and that the version of the story you're being given is more or less the complete one. That ask is not unique to CERN. It is the ask that modern civilization makes of everyone who lives inside it, every single day, in domains ranging from the food on your plate to the financial instruments in your pension fund to the software running on the devices in your pocket. The ask is, trust us. And most of the time, most people do. Because the alternative is not actually viable. You cannot grow your own food and generate your own power, and manufacture your own medicine, and audit your own financial system, and independently verify the engineering of every bridge you drive across. The complexity of modern civilization requires distributed trust the way a body requires a circulatory system. It is not optional. It is the mechanism, but trust is not knowledge. This distinction is one of the most important things I can say in this entire video, and I want to make sure it lands clearly. Trust and knowledge are different epistemic states, and they feel different from the inside, and they have different consequences for how you relate to the world. Knowledge closes a question. When you know something, the question of whether it is true is settled, and you can move on. Trust leaves the question open with a residue, a small persistent background hum of what if, and that hum does not go away no matter how reasonable the trust is, or how well earned the credibility of the institution you are trusting. The hum is structural. It is built into the nature of trust itself. In ordinary circumstances, with ordinary institutions making ordinary claims, this residue is manageable. It sits in the background of consciousness and does not significantly interfere with daily functioning. You trust that the bridge will hold, and you drive across it, and the hum stays quiet. But CERN is not an ordinary institution making ordinary claims. CERN is an institution specifically and explicitly engaged in searching for things about reality that are not yet known. The official framing is not here is what is true. The official framing is here is what we are trying to find out, and here is what we think we might be looking for, and here is our best current model, and here is how the data compares to the model, and here is what the model cannot yet account for. This is the honest language of active scientific inquiry, and it is genuinely admirable. It is also, for anyone who needs certainty to feel safe, genuinely terrifying. Because when an institution says trust us in the context of things we already know, you are being asked to trust a set of established facts with a solid track record of being correct. When an institution says trust us in the context of things we are still figuring out, you are being asked to trust a process, an ongoing investigation whose conclusions are by definition not yet final. Those are very different requests, and the second one leaves a much larger opening for the what if to grow. CERN, asking for public trust, is asking people to be comfortable with organised uncertainty. It is asking people to accept that the machine is safe, even though the safety was assessed by internal bodies and ratified by legal systems that declined to evaluate the underlying physics. It is asking people to accept that the results, including the null results, are the complete picture. It is asking people to find adequate the explanation that nothing beyond the standard model has been found, when the expectation was that something beyond the standard model should have been visible by now. Every one of these asks lands differently depending on your prior relationship to institutional authority and your tolerance for unresolved questions. And the distribution of tolerance for unresolved questions is not even across a population. For some people, not knowing is the most exciting possible condition. For many more people, not knowing is a source of ongoing low-grade anxiety. And people in a state of low-grade anxiety are exactly the audience that clear, simple, narratively satisfying alternative explanations are designed for, whether intentionally or not. The Mandela effect offered exactly that. It took the diffuse, hard-to-locate anxiety of living in a world whose foundations are not personally accessible and gave it a specific address. Something happened at CERN. The machine opened a door. The timeline changed. That is why the bears have an E in your memory. That is why the Monopoly man has a monocle. That is why the quote does not match the recording. The explanation is wrong. The cognitive science is clear and the historical record is unambiguous. But the anxiety the explanation addresses is real, and real anxiety does not dissolve when the explanation for it is debunked. It finds another explanation. Or it sits with the debunked one and continues, because even a wrong explanation that gives the anxiety an address is more livable than a correct explanation that leaves it homeless. This is the most honest framing I can offer for the entire arc of this story. Nothing changed in the physics in 2009. The machine did not alter the timeline. The memories are wrong for reasons that have nothing to do with dimensional physics and everything to do with the predictable limitations of human memory reconstruction. And yet something genuinely changed in 2009, not in space-time, but in the cultural experience of being a conscious person navigating an increasingly opaque world. Something shifted in how it felt to live next door, metaphorically speaking, to systems of knowledge whose operations you cannot observe and whose conclusions you cannot independently verify. We are all living downstream of a realization, not an event, a realization. The realization that the world has layers we cannot access, that the institutions managing those layers are asking for trust we have no independent means of validating, and that even our own memories, the most intimate and personal verification system available to a human being, are reconstructive processes capable of producing confident, specific shared errors. These three things arriving in cultural consciousness at roughly the same time, in the same window as the LHC restart and the naming of the Mandela effect, and the internet reaching the density required to make shared confusion feel like collective evidence, created a moment whose effects have not dissipated in 16 years. The question how would we know is not rhetorical. It is the actual operative question, and the honest answer to it is that we would know imperfectly, indirectly, through instruments built by people we have to trust, using models we cannot fully evaluate, producing conclusions that are always provisional and always subject to revision in the light of new data. This is not a criticism of science. It is a description of science, and it is also a description of the best available method for collectively approaching truth that human civilization has yet developed. It is just not the method of absolute personal certainty that the human mind was built to crave, and the gap between what the mind craves and what the actual epistemic situation provides is precisely where the Mandela effect lives, and where the door metaphor lives, and where the number 17 lives, and where the persistent feeling that the restart in 2009 was the beginning of something that has not yet fully arrived lives. If a door opened in 2009, and I want to be careful and precise here, no physical door opened in any literal or scientifically documented sense. The door that opened was inside the collective understanding of how much we do not know about the world we inhabit. It was the door between the comfortable ambient assumption that reality is fully and directly accessible to anyone paying careful attention, and the more difficult knowledge that at every scale, from the 10 to the minus 26 seconds of a particle interaction to the decades-long arc of an institution's research program, the world reaches us already filtered through instruments and models and languages and assumptions that are never perfectly transparent and never perfectly complete. That door was always there. It has been there since the first human being looked up at the night sky and felt, on some pre-linguistic level, the overwhelming scale of something that would never fit inside the categories available to the mind looking at it. The awareness of the gap between the universe and the human capacity to contain it is as old as consciousness itself. But for most of human history, for most people, that awareness stayed at the edges. It was philosophy, or religion, or the private 3 a.m. feeling that dissolves by morning. It was not a news story. It was not a machine you could visit. It was not something a credentialed physicist described at a press conference using the word door. CERN made it a press conference. The LHC made it a machine with an address. And Bertolucci's sentence made it a quote that travelled around the world and has not stopped travelling. Not because the physics was wrong, but because the distance between the physics and the people hearing about it was too wide for the metaphor to stay metaphorical. It became literal in transit. It became a description of something that happened rather than a description of something being theorized. And once it became that, it stayed that, because the feeling it named, the feeling of hidden layers, of processes beyond observation, of trust asked in domains where knowledge is not available, was already there waiting to be named. The Large Hadron Collider is still running. Right now, as you read this or listen to this, somewhere beneath the Swiss-French border, 100 meters underground, protons are circulating in a ring 27 kilometers in circumference, completing 11,000 loops per second and colliding with energies that briefly recreate conditions from the earliest moments of the universe. The data from those collisions is being collected, filtered, analyzed, and compared to models by thousands of scientists who have dedicated their professional lives to this work. Somewhere in that data there may be a signal that current models do not predict, a pattern that does not fit, a number that does not add up in the way the standard model says it should. Or there may not be. We are looking. The machine is doing what the machine was built to do. But the door that Bertolucci was describing, the door that a 10 to the minus 26 second interaction might briefly hold open, is not the door that this story has ultimately been about. This story has been about a different door, the one that opened in how we think about what is real and what is knowable and what we are actually doing when we trust institutions that operate in domains we cannot independently access. The one that revealed the flaw of things going down further than comfortable daylight reasoning tends to follow. That door did not open in 2009 specifically. It has been there throughout. But 2009, with its restarted machine and its physicist at a microphone, and its named phenomenon of mass shared memory error arriving in the same cultural breath, is when a very large number of people got close enough to it to feel the air moving through it. And now that you are standing here, having followed this whole long thread, I want to give you the question we started with one more time. Not as a rhetorical device, as an actual thing to hold. If something happened in that tunnel, subtle and brief and unmodelled, in November of 2009, and if it left no signature that any current instrument was configured to catch, and if its effect was diffuse and statistical rather than sharp and locatable, we have already established that no test currently available to us could distinguish that world from the one we are actually in, which means we are, in the most technically precise sense available, unable to close the question. Not because of a cover-up, because of the structure of knowledge at the frontier of what knowledge can currently reach. The best thing to do with that, the most scientifically honest and humanly honest response to it, is to hold it without resolving it. Not with fear. Not with the false comfort of a theory that gives the uncertainty an address it does not have. Just with the clear acknowledgement that the universe is not obligated to be fully legible to us at this stage of our development. We are early in this. The instruments are new. The models are incomplete. The questions that matter most are still open. Something somewhere is colliding right now. At energies you cannot feel, on timescales you cannot experience, in a place you will most likely never go. And everything we are, every memory we trust and every memory we misplace, and every question we cannot close, and every institution we extend our trust to, and every feeling we have that something does not quite add up, all of it is made of the same stuff those collisions are probing. We are the experiment too, we just did not sign the consent form.